So then, good evening. Good evening. Yes. So, for the 7-point mind training, I thought for tonight and tomorrow, maybe I can talk on some of the points. And then the third day, then maybe the formal reading of the 7-point mind training text. So the 7-point mind training by Geshe Chekawa. So when he heard of this, when he heard these words from the 8-point mind training by Geshe Langri Thangpa, the point where it says, I will offer the victory to the other, and that I will take defeat upon myself and then offer the victory to other. When he heard this, then he was intrigued by this, and then and wanted to learn more about this. But unfortunately, Geshe Langri Thangpa had already passed. So then he received these instructions, the mind training instructions from Geshe Sharawa, from Geshe Sharawa, who was one of the main disciples of Geshe Langri Thangpa. So then when he first met Geshe Sharawa, then Geshe Chekawa asked Geshe Sharawa, how important is this practice, this practice of taking defeat upon oneself and then offering the victory to the other? How important is this practice? And then after some time, then Geshe Sharawa replied, well, if you want to attain Buddhahood, then this practice is indispensable. So without practicing, without relying on this practice, then it is impossible to attain Buddhahood, right? So this was the answer that Geshe Sharawa gave. And now the 7-point lojong is part of the lojong genre, lojong or mind training. This is in a way, it's related with the Lamrim genre, the Lamrim practice, and it is an extension of the Lamrim. It relates with the cultivation of bodhichitta, particularly the conventional bodhichitta. And as you know, there are two methods, and this is connected with the second method, exchanging self with other, exchanging self with others method. So this is what mind training is, training one's mind in the two awakening minds, and particularly the conventional bodhicitta primarily by means of exchanging the self with other, exchanging oneself with the other method. So the 7 points, the first is the presentation of the preliminaries, and then the second is the training in the two awakening minds, and then the third, taking adversities onto the path of enlightenment, the fourth, is the presentation of a lifetime's practice in summary. The fifth, the measure of having trained one's mind. And then 6 and 7 are the precepts, first the commitments and then the precepts of mind training. So these are the 7 points. And then the first, the presentation of the preliminaries. This refers to the practice that one has to engage in, that one has to cultivate, that one has to take on before training in the two awakening minds, in the two bodhicittas. So as we have that categorization in the Lamrim, the Lamrim teaching is based on Adisha's text. Is it Bodhipatta Pradipa, or a lamp illuminating the path to enlightenment? It is based on that. And I think Tolungpa, Lama Tolungpa, who was a disciple of Lotsawa London Sherab, he composed one text called Tenrim, and then Je Rinpoche based the Lamrim Chemo on that text, right? Tenrim Chemo, which itself is again based on Changju Lamde, the lamp illuminating the path to enlightenment by Adisha Dipamgara Shirigyana. So then I think one could say that Adisha came with this classification, with this categorization of the 3 parts, the part that accords with the person of small capacity, of middling capacity, and of great capacity, right? So the presentation of the preliminaries then refers to our engagement in the 2 common parts that accord with the person, with the first and the second persons, right? The small capacity and then the middling capacity. So this is the presentation of the preliminary. This is what presentation of the preliminary refers to. Why this is important is that if one tries to engage in the training of the 2 bodhicitta, of the 2 awakening minds, conventional and ultimate bodhicitta, directly, then it's highly likely that this might not result in cultivation of these 2 awakening minds, unless, of course, one has already had a very strong karmic imprint. One has already engaged in the preliminaries in the past life and still has very strong imprints from past lives. That would be exceptional, but the norm is that one has to first engage in the preliminary practices before engaging in the cultivation of the 2 awakening minds. And so first is that here I think this teaching of our Sakya teachers, of our Sakya masters, as you know, the 4 Shenpa Shitel, parting away from the 4 attachments, right? So beginning with the attachment for this life, parting away from the attachment for this life, then parting away from attachment for future lives, and then parting away from the attachment of self-concern, then parting away from the attachment to grasping, right? So these four teachings is really wonderful how it presents the teachings in that way. And of course this overlaps with the Je Rinpoche's categorization of the three principal aspects of the path, which is renunciation, then bodhichitta in correct view, and then with the parting away from the four clingings, four attachments or clingings, then there's this very nice way of really capturing this essence by stating that if one has not parted away from clinging onto this life, then one is not in the Dharma. One is not practicing the Dharma, and if one has not parted away from clinging onto future lives, then one has not renunciated, and if one has not parted away from self-concern, then one has not cultivated bodhicitta, and if one has not parted away from grasping, then one has not gained insight. One has not gained insight, wisdom. So in this way, then the first is, the most important thing is parting away from this fascination for this life. This is the beginning point. This is the starting point for our Dharma practice, for our journey onto the path of enlightenment. It has to start by really thinking about. We have to sort of rethink our strategy. Something like rethinking the strategy. Until now, then we are very much. We always operate. We prepare for, and our end is our goal. They are very much in the confinement of this life, of just our life, right? Of just one lifetime. So then we are so into thinking only about the pleasures of this life and seeking comfort and thinking only about this life. So this is what we have to overcome. Just seeing this life, just chasing the pleasures of this life, right? So this is what we have to overcome. So we have to, if we are able to overcome this mode of thinking, this way of having this very narrow-minded approach, I think in desiring for happiness, if we really wish to be happy, then we have to part away with this narrow-minded approach, using only seeing only in the context of just this life, right? So we have to part away from that. This is number one, right? This is the most important thing. And how does one do that? Then of course the great teacher, the Buddha Shakyamuni, then gave the teachings on the Four Noble Truths, and with each of these truths, then the Buddha explained four aspects, and for the truth of suffering, then of course beginning with impermanence, right? Beginning with impermanence. So this is very important for our preliminary practice, to direct our mind towards impermanence. And impermanence, sometimes I feel, is a euphemism for death, for death. And this is what we have to think about, that if we do not think about death, then we are always thinking about this life, right? So this is why in order to break through, in order to break away from this narrow-mindedness, from just being confined to thinking only about this life's pleasures, then thinking about impermanence, thinking about death is very important. And by thinking about death, and then this also helps us contemplate about asking these such questions as what happens after death, right? Then do I stop? Does my mind stop? Does the continuum? Does the mind cease after death? So these kind of questions can only arise if one contemplates death, right? Otherwise, merely just asking these questions like, does the mind come to a cease after death? If we do not really think about our impending death, then I think something is lacking in that investigation. It is not really sincere. It's not really coming from one's heart. So therefore, the Buddha emphasized, death, not just merely as a concept or a philosophical point, but really our impending death, how all that comes into, that arises, will have to cease. This is the nature of things. It is our nature, right? So to be not afraid. Well, of course, we all are afraid of death, but then we should not be so afraid of death that we don't even want to contemplate it, right? So it is important that that we have something like a healthy fear, a healthy fear for death. I think this is good, Of course, if sometimes I think I hear people say, death is something that will happen, definitely. So then, because that will happen, then, why think about it? Why be afraid of it? And instead we should enjoy fully, when we are alive, right? Of course, this is a very optimistic approach. But then, when we think of karma, when we think of the mind as not completely coming to a stop after death, if we accept that theory, then we might as well as prepare for the next phase, and not simply just reap, not simply just what's the expression? Not simply just enjoying, but maybe something like planning for the future might be a good idea, right? So like this, and then from the more positive aspect, then in the Lamrim it explains about how our human rebirth, how our human existence has the 18 qualities, right? The 18 features, and so forth. But maybe I can explain it like this: that if you think about it, we humans, we have this. We have the human intelligence, right? We have this incredible human intelligence, and our intelligence, because of this intelligence, then this helps us in maximizing our compassion, also our compassion, our love, our kind-heartedness towards other. This can be really enhanced by our human intelligence, right? So this is something that I think no other forms of life, as we know it, it's something. This feature is something that they don't have. So this is really unique. This is a unique quality of our existence, of our rebirth, right? So this is something that we have to really appreciate, to really appreciate that we have this wonderful human intelligence, and that we can, with this intelligence, then we can empathize with others, and also by using, by using various methods, then we can really enhance and fine-tune our compassion, our empathy, and so forth. So again, to rejoice in that, I think is wonderful. It's a good thing, and it helps to, I think, to recognize, to acknowledge that we have this innate capacity. As human beings, we all have this capacity to empathize with others, to understand how others are feeling, using our situations, using our feelings as the reference point. Then we can use our intelligence like that, right? So in those ways, then we really have to recognize, and we have to rejoice, and really have a sense of appreciation. This is so important. Yeah, this is so important. So before we actually go into training the two awakening minds, developing these basic attitude, right? Something like an attitude, an approach to life, I think is so important. Is so important. So this are not to be overlooked. If we do not see this, if we do not appreciate all the good qualities that we all have as human beings, if we overlook that, and then, for example, go straight into bodhicitta, if you go straight into bodhicitta, if you try to generate compassion for others, let's say, then there is the risk that we might become overwhelmed. There's the risk that we might become overwhelmed if we do not really appreciate our qualities. If we neglect ourselves, if we are not careful, if we do not skillfully train in compassion, then there is the risk that this could lead to something like self-negligence, or even something like, or we might become overwhelmed by contemplating the suffering of others, right? We might, and in that process, then something like, I think, our self-esteem could decrease. So there are those risks. This is why then I think this is one other thing why why we also have to engage in the preliminary practice to build a solid foundation. To build a solid foundation, right? This is it's important to do that. Yeah. And then again, after impermanence, then thinking about suffering, right? Thinking about suffering. So I think we really have to define suffering. We have to try to define suffering. What is suffering, right? So to really put it in a simple term, then suffering is, I think, when things don't go our way. This is suffering, right? When things are not going our way, of course, this is suffering, right? So the state in which things are out of our control, in which our minds are out of our control, the state in which we are, and why are we not in control of our minds? Because we are subjected. Our mind is subjected due to past karma and afflictions. Because we have not dealt with them, then then our karma, our past karma, and our current mental afflictions, they bring much disturbances in our mind, in our being, right? And this state is what we call samsara, samsara, right? And this is what we have to realize this state as suffering. If we simply think of suffering as conventionally as something like, if we only associate suffering on a feeling level, then our understanding of suffering is not complete. And if we think of suffering also like in the second level, the second type of suffering, if we only recognize that as suffering, then again it is not complete, right? So we have to think about this state in which one is influenced by karma and klesha, and know that state as suffering. And this is what the Buddha meant, when he said one has to know suffering. To know suffering is to know that this state, that our current state, is very much influenced by karma and klesha, by mental afflictions and by the actions that are motivated by them, right? So this is again very important in the context of setting the stage for training in the two awakening minds. So, as Jeremy had said in his three principal aspects of the path, that by contemplating how the human existence is so precious and is endowed with so many great qualities, and yet that it is so easy to lose that very existence, then fascinations for this life will come to a cease. And then by contemplating how that by contemplating karma, and by contemplating, then what is the second line? The second two, line number 3 and 4. What is it now? Let's see. Excuse me? Yes. Okay. Can you help? Can anyone intervene? And then, so the first two lines talks about, by contemplating that this human existence is so precious, has so many qualities, yet it is so easy to lose, then fascinations for this life will come to a cease, right? So that's 2 points. The 2 points is contemplating how the human existence is so hard to find and has so many qualities. This is the first point. The second point is yet how easily that can be lost is the second point, right? Oh yes, yes. Oh, thank you, thank you. Yes. And then the second two lines, by repeatedly thinking about the karmic causality, and then thinking about samsaric suffering, these 2 points, then preoccupations for the next life will come to a cease, right? So these 4 points, this is what we have to think about, what we need to contemplate in the preliminary practice. Okay, so maybe we are good for now. And now, yes, so shall we have our interaction? This is, I think, the good time to do that. Yes, yes.
Anyone has questions? Otherwise,
So
yeah, Derek.
Good evening, Rinpoche. It's not so much a question, but I think many people are lost because the printed text that is here is not quite according to what Rinpoche has expounded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I remember what Rinpoche has expounded through other texts, but in this booklet, I find it difficult to exactly follow.
Mm. Okay, so here we have 2 versions of 7-point mind training. So right now I'm following the 7-point mind training. This is the one that was the Geshe Thupten Jinpa's translation. Presentation of the preliminaries, the basis. First train in the preliminaries. So for tonight, then I think I will only go with the first point. So I've given something like the background for that, the preliminary practices, and so then I thought many of you are familiar with the Lamrim and of course with the lojong. So this is why I feel I will stop talking for the time being, and then that you can share, you can share your inputs or your question, anything would be good. Yeah. Derek, I don't think I answered your question though. So could you? Oh, the mic. Yes.
So Rinpoche, I need to go back to my other prayer books where there are reference of lojong,
Mm-hmm.
and because you almost recited it perfectly from those texts.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of those words,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the phrases, specific phrases that you have mentioned, I don't see in this book. And therefore, just now when Rinpoche was asking for point number 3, line number 3, line number 4.
Right. But this
I had trouble, and I saw a lot of people were also trying to find which line.
I'm sorry. Yes. So this verse that I was trying to convey is not from the lojong, but it's from Je Rinpoche's 3 principal aspects of the path. Yes. So right. I'm sorry. Yeah. So this is not from lojong. This is from Je Rinpoche's 3 principal aspects of the path. So I thought that verse, we say in Tibetan, I think lo dog nam shi, right? So I think something like maybe the four thoughts that one has to stop, the four thoughts that one has to stop. Lo dog nam shi. But anyhow, these 4 points, one has to these 4 points. Okay, the 4 points is that the human existence is endowed with so many qualities. This is the first point. The second is that yet it can be lost easily. This is the second point. And then the third point is thinking about is it the karmic results, the karmic causation, and then the fourth point is then the samsaric suffering, So the first 2 points, by contemplating in the first 2 points, then preoccupations for this life will cease, and then by contemplating on the point, on the third and fourth point, then preoccupations with regard to future lives will come to a cease, right? And so these two so then to put it back in the practice of the three persons, then with the first 2 points, then this is really what this is the essential point, of the path that accords with the person of the small capacity, and then the point number 3 and 4. Then this is these are the main points for the main points or main focus of the path of the common path that accords with the person of middling capacity.
Rinpoche, okay, my first question is like for the preliminary that one has to establish before receiving the teaching of mind training at the very basic level. One is will only become a Dharma practitioner when you give up this life. But for people who has been around and receiving this mind training like Dharma for many years, and it could be very, to be honest, it's like after 20, 30 years, I don't think I'm still a practitioner because I've not given up this life. I'm still very much affected by the 8 worldly concern, reputation, wanting people to say nice thing about me, and not developing, I'm not able to develop equanimity towards suffering and happiness. So knowing, so how does one then overcome this, sometimes the feeling of disheartened feeling, knowing that after many years it's still so difficult to give up this life, and the more you know, the more you know that is you. Sometimes you check your mind, you know that you are not really a Dharma practitioner. Yeah.
Oh. So, thank you for your question. I think you are speaking on our behalf. I feel like you're not only speaking for yourself, but on the behalf of so many people, right? So I think, it is really sometimes, I used to think that meditating on compassion or bodhicitta was simply trying to align our minds with bodhicitta. In other words, to have to try to emulate what we call the object of the mind and something like the representation. Something is it representation of the mind? Yeah, it's almost like trying to have the same mind, So bodhicitta is that is wishing for enlightenment for the sake of others. That is what bodhicitta is. So then one might think, well, if I want to meditate on bodhicitta, then I just have to think like that. I just have to develop this wish to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings, and then try to think like that, sort of try to force oneself, force yourself to think like that, right? So with this kind of approach, then then later, then I think, I found out that this is not the case. This isn't how one actually begins the meditation on bodhicitta, right? One has to first, again, really work on the foundations. One has to build up. It is a what is that word? Bottom up, right? Top down and then bottom up, right? So we have to use the bottom up approach. This is very important. Otherwise, then there's a danger that after so many years of hearing these great teachings on the two awakening minds, especially on conventional bodhicitta, and always hearing these teachings and then somehow trying to say the words and somehow trying to go into those states, those higher states, somehow trying to emulate those. If we simply just do that, and if do that with, by overlooking the preliminaries, then there is the risk that one might find oneself in the situation that you just explained, right? So then this is why I think we really have to, go back to really our current situation, and really then work on our problems, as that, you highlighted this situation. You highlighted how, despite many years being in the Dharma, somehow there is this strong attachment to the mundane thoughts, right? Mundane thoughts, right? So then something is obviously not working, so far. Then this shows that whatever that we have done until this point, until today, we didn't do it correctly, So then, why are we still attached to the worldly dharmas? Why? Even though we try and try and try, it's almost like it's like going to the this it's like, what's that place called, where you have like the bow, this archery. It's like taking archery lessons, and then shooting lots of arrows, but not hitting the target, right? So this somehow, it seems that if we are not careful, if we simply practice something because of formality, then there is a risk that we could end up like that, shooting arrows, but shooting without seeing the target, sometimes not even seeing the target, right? Sometimes we see the target, but still we are not shooting straight. At other times, we don't even see the target, and we just, mindlessly, we are shooting arrows, right? So this could be a case of that, I think, So if that is the case, then how do we deal with this very particular example, of being attached to the 8 worldly dharmas? Here, I think we don't have to use, we don't have to use emptiness or compassion. We don't go there. Right now, we are on the first. Right now, we are stuck in this practice that accords with the person of, the first stage, the beginner level. This is our level. We are beginners. Okay, that's very good. So then, what do? Is that we have, whenever when we try to solve a problem, we should always be specific, to be specific. So now that the problem is clear for us, then how do we deal with that? So the 8 worldly dharmas, having this mundane concern, then we have to think about how does this come about? How does this come about, right? So then, I think the solution here is to think, is because we are not thinking about impermanence. This is why we have something like a fantasy, By not thinking about impermanence, then we develop all these fantasies of what our life should be, right? We develop all these concepts about, what a happy life is, what a happy life constitutes, right? So, if you think about it, all these 8 worldly dharmas, these mundane thoughts, they arise as a result of having those unrealistic expectations from life. And how do we overcome that? How do we dismantle all these unrealistic conceptions of a happy life? It is by thinking about impermanence. This is what we have to use on the first level. We have to use impermanence. Of course, we all know impermanence. We always see it. We witness death. But somehow, because we are already deeply engrossed in this, we already have a pretty good idea of what a happy life constitutes. That's why we don't want to go there. That's why we want to avoid impermanence as much as we can, right? So we have to really direct our mind towards that. This is the only way. At this level, to overcome mundane thoughts. If we do not think about impermanence, then I think it is really impossible to switch from the 8 worldly dharmas, to switch off the 8 worldly dharmas, right? So then, just as masters of the past, they would do a long retreat on just impermanence, right? On just one point, and they will spend months and months thinking, contemplate, to the point that impermanence permeates your thoughts, it permeates your being, to to the point that whatever you look at, whatever you see impermanence. You know, this is where we need to get our mind level. You know, we have to get our mind on that level, you know, so that whatever we see impermanence. If we come into contact with a pleasant object, we see impermanence right there. And how can we get to that level? We can only get to that level by trying, by directing our mind towards impermanence, you know, right? If we always try to avoid impermanence, no, that obviously we will not get to that. By using this tactic, you know, we are really trying to be very smart, but it's almost like we are outsmarting ourselves, right? By trying to avoid the subject of death, you know, of our impending death. So we have to really think about death to the point that we see every living forms as being in this process, you know, in that it is in a way dying, you know, so that when we see living things, then we actually see a dying being, you know. When we see something that's so pleasant, we actually see that it is changing from that pleasantness, you know, it is changing away from its pleasant quality. You know, if we can develop our mind to that level, then overcoming the eight worldly dharmas it's not a distant dream, right? But if we are always trying to avoid the subject of death, the subject of impermanence, and trying to always chase these dreams, you know, chase these dreams, chase these ideals, you know, we have these certain ideas of what happiness is and all that. Okay, then that's one thing, right? But if you do not try to change anything on that level and then simply try to, say, train in the two awakening minds, maybe with all that effort, I can definitely say we are in a way sowing seeds for the future, you know, definitely. If one is, you know, if one has a very limited view and is only thinking about just this life, then it's somehow better to think, you know, it is of course better to engage or at least try to engage in training in the two bodhicittas than not trying. Of course it's better, right? But then would one really would one really then develop spontaneous bodhicitta? Would one develop a certain level of spontaneity in that practice? Then I think this is very difficult, right? Without changing from this rigid, without changing our rigid ideas of what happiness is, you know, and how that is so important, you know, our view that happiness is something that is so important only in the context of this life, this kind of approach, then this is what is really holding us back, you know, from our practice, right? So then I think for those of us who has a Buddhist background, in this way I think this is a huge advantage. You know, it is a huge advantage because we are already accepting rebirth, right? We already have a certain base there. So now all it takes is we have to think, we have to turn our mind, you know, it is as on a philosophical level, then we accept the theory of rebirth, right? We accept that there is something beyond just this life, right? But in practice, then it seems, in many cases, to be the other way around. In practice, then we are only thinking about just this life, right? So we have to, we have to narrow that gap, between our practice and between what we believe and what we really practice, right? So we have to find that way of narrowing that gap. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. Oh, second floor. Okay.
林伯切啊，我不会讲英语哈，请你原谅啊，不要怪我。我问你哈，那个我们修佛的基础哦，是要从念死无常跟暇满人生，深信因果，还有那个什么解脱人为这一步开始哈，要打好它基础，我们才可以有菩提心，才有悲心，是吗？ 林伯切啊，我大概是这样啦，因为我上课哦，从下士道、中士道、上士道哦，我只知道说要念死无常啊、暇满人生啊、深信因果啊，还有这解脱轮回啊，一定要到最后才有解脱轮回嘞。到了解脱轮回会不会成佛啊？会有成佛的因啊，有造到成佛的因啊。 我要问林伯切，还有那个我们要舍弃世间八法很重要是吗？谢谢林伯切。
哦。
Rinpoche, I summarize her question. Her question first, she's trying to ask that is it necessary to practice to meditate on impermanence and death, and also the law of cause and effect, and then as the foundation to practice bodhichitta? Is that right? And then for her, she says she has. For the practice of the three levels of capable beings, she has heard about the lower, middle, and higher capacities, and then also she knows that she need to practice like has impermanence and death, perfect human rebirth, and also law of cause and effect. And then through this practice, finally you can achieve liberation. So then she also asks, by achieving liberation, then does this lead to achieving enlightenment or not?
Oh, so with the first point, then you're right. Yes, one has to meditate on these 2 points. So basically the part that accords with the person of the small capacity and of the middling capacity prior to cultivating the 2 awakening minds, and specifically the generation of conventional bodhichitta. So you're right, but in some cases, for example, it is said that our great teacher, the Buddha Shakyamuni, in one of his lifetimes, it explains how he generated bodhichitta, and here he was born as a in the hell realm, and then he was I think doing this how do you say Shingta bekend. I don't even know how to say it in English. It's almost like he was pulling this chariot, I think, yeah, something like that. Pulling a chariot, right? Chariot. So there are chariots in hell. Yes. I never thought of it like that, but because in Tibetan it sounds very good and we don't ask questions. But in English, he was, at that time he was born in the hell realm and was pulling a chariot. Then do they have chariots in hell realms? So this comes up. Somehow it seems that when I'm using English, then I'm asking more questions. But when I'm in Tibetan, then I don't ask questions. I go straight. So I think for me, this thinking in Tibetan is really the best thing. So that was quite unrelated. But anyhow, so he was born at that time as in the hell realm and was pulling this chariot with one fellow, and then one of the hell guards, one of the guards, they were beating his fellow. So at that point, then he developed this strong compassion, and then it is said that he generated great compassion. I mean, bodhichitta, like that, right? So this is really, and then I've seen commentaries explaining that at that point, then the Buddha, prior to being born in the hell realm, had already meditated on the, trained in the 6 causes prior, before he had already meditated and cultivated those 6 causes, and then was born in the hell realm. And that incident then, it sparked, the effect, which is bodhicitta, right? So this is how it is explained. So in some situations, then I think, yes, even in one lifetime, one may not have had gone through meditating on all these points, and all it takes is just being in some situations like this. Then that could ignite bodhicitta, because one has already had already worked on generating bodhicitta in the previous lives and has strong seeds for that, right? So those are exceptions, of course, right? But otherwise, then it is I think always good, to develop a systematic approach in generating bodhicitta. And then your second question, yes, does liberation, does that mean one is enlightened, right? Enlightenment. So this is a very interesting question. So if you say, well, I think this is correct. If one is liberated from samsara, from this cyclic existence, then one is enlightened. You are an enlightened being, right? But then here, then maybe one could say you may be enlightened, but you're not fully enlightened, right? Or something like that, right? So as we say, the Mahabodhi, right? Which is something like the full enlightenment, right? So this would only refer to Buddhahood, but Buddhahood as we know it, as we use that term, is only explained in the context of a fully developed, of a full state of enlightenment, a complete enlightenment, if you will. We are always using Buddhahood in that context, but in a way, even the arhats, Shavakayana or the Praditya Buddha, of those parts are in a way Buddhas, because Buddha really means the enlightened one, right? So it depends on how we use those terms and the context yeah. Okay, so thank you. As you say, Sisi. Yeah. Okay. So
I'll ask the next question. Rinpoche, there is a printed question from an anonymous. So the first question is, Dear Rinpoche, what is the difference between sadness and compassion? Is it possible to generate compassion without feeling sad?
So this is again a very good question. In one of the Mind in Life conferences a few years back, His Holiness was attending, and then I think it was one of the presenters talked about this issue, the issue of healthcare workers, how many of them were stressed from their work, obviously, and then how some of them were quite depressed, and that they felt almost like worthless because in the face when being in the situation that they were in, they felt so helpless, and by empathizing so much on the patients like this, by emphasizing so much on the situation, then they felt really helpless and they felt depressed, right? So then, nevertheless, then the presenter said that then make this distinction between empathy and compassion. So to those who didn't empathize too much with the patients, but nevertheless had compassion, those people then did not suffer from depression, whereas those that group which not only had compassion but also empathized with the patients, with the situation, then that group tend to suffer from depression more, right? So there is then the presenter made this fine line, this fine distinction between compassion and empathy, right? But then again, these two terms, I think they are always used interchangeably. So this is what makes it difficult. And then I remember, it was in Germany, Erlangen, with a small group, very nice group, and one of the participants then she has a background in, I think, psychotherapy. She's a psychiatrist. So she shared that having compassion for others, but to not identify with the other person, that would help in avoiding this kind of situations, right? So again, this is, I think, is helpful, right? But then one can always again ask, well, if you do not identify with the other person, then how can you be compassionate, right? So again, we have this issue, right? So, but then definitely, at least from my understanding, I would, of course, make a distinction between compassion and sadness. And of course, compassion does not equate sadness. Otherwise, the Buddha, the fully enlightened ones, they always would have to be sad, right? Because they have this, because their compassion is really the highest point. It has reached the highest point, right? So then it wouldn't be very fun to be a Buddha, So if you think like this, then of course, by virtue of that, then I think, of course, compassion doesn't necessarily equate sadness. So then how do we do this? Well, then I think, I don't know so much, but my hunch is that perhaps, if we have to approach compassion skillfully, and then this is why to develop, first of all, a healthy self-esteem. I think it's very important, to first work on that, to have a healthy self-view, to have a healthy way of looking at yourself, not blaming yourself, that kind of thing. So developing a healthy self-esteem, I think is very important before really, diving into, always contemplating the suffering of others, compassion like this, right? So to develop this, I think, is very important and, of course, practical. Yes, so thank you. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I'll move.
Oh, yes.
Rinpoche, I think I rather have a question. It's not really a question. I think it's a recent incident which I met with another centers where they actually doing a lot of charities through their own co-op. So they actually produce rice and organic food. So when we are on this topic of compassion, I was arguing on the ground that they actually harvesting all the plants and everything to make into food and then to sell them. I say, is this the right way for a Buddhist to do? But at the same time, he said, what can you do? He said, you probably have a free mind. Your mind are free. But you still have your physical body. And you still have to go through all this sadness, and then you probably have your compassion, but at the same time, you are doing nothing. You say, at least we are doing something. And that's where I was stuck, and I do not know how to answer the question. So I just want to share this incident. So.
Oh, thank you. Also, so this person was engaging in this kind of work in order to for charity, right? So
And he's supporting a monastery of around 3,000 people.
I see. By having this kind of livelihood, right?
Yes,
By relying
he
on this
has his own
livelihood.
farm. Then
Right.
he's harvest the crops and then build into organic biscuit or organic rice and things like that, and make the profit from there, and then to support the monastery. So that's when I'm not sure how the karma comes in also.
I think this is a good way to support the Sangha. But maybe I think your question was, well, if we engage in that kind of livelihood, then we have to, for example, kill many insects like this and so forth. So you were thinking from this standpoint, right?
That's right. And then his argument is to me that you are not doing anything at all. At least I'm doing something. He said, probably you have a free mind. You have a higher spirit, but at least I'm the guy who are doing something.
Oh. So then, what should I say now?
That's where I get speechless also.
So, what I can tell you is that you have your points, and so does he. You both have good points. you both have good points. But then who am I, to judge, So we can really practice the Dharma really according to our disposition, according to our place, from the place that we come from. What are maybe I'm better suited to not engage in this kind of livelihood, and then maybe by not being engaged in having such a livelihood, I can play my part better, Then for a certain type of person, they are already in this situation, and they have a very strong faith in the Sangha, and they want to support the Sangha, so then it makes sense to use this form of livelihood as a means to support the Sangha, right? So I think, really, the ways in which we can support the Sangha, the ways in which we can practice the Dharma is infinite, is infinite, and I think this is really good, and how you told that person like that, I think it's good for that person, because the person then can recheck, can check what he is doing, and by sharing your concern, then that person, the next time he has to, harvest, then that person might be more mindful in how to deal with the insects and so forth, right? And also how that person, with his answer to you, then it also, I think, it also gives you an equal good chance to again to rethink, about how you can also contribute, how we can also contribute, right? So this is what I take from your interaction with your friend, and thank you for sharing that with all of us. So thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so this is the last question, Rinpoche. In the last teachings, Rinpoche, in your response to a question, Rinpoche mentioned the 4 purities, that it is good to see the environment as pure, beings as deities, etc. However, in our current state, what we see are suffering beings in an impure environment. How do we reconcile the two? On a practical level, should we constantly remind ourselves that the suffering beings are actually deities?
So the last time I said it was in the context of course, of Tantra, the 4 Turu purities. This is, I think, only in the context of tantric practice, and I was talking about that situation with one of my friends, and talking about, and I had some reservations, at least I put it in that form, that some doubt about whether we should really encourage people to view their gurus as Buddhas. So my friend said, well, because we have to anyhow apply the 4 thorough purities, maybe we can also apply the 4 thorough purities in the context of our lamas, right, of our teachers. So this is how he said it, and this was in that context, and in anyhow the 4 thorough purities is only in the context for our tantric practice. In general, yes, I think we also have to be realists, and we have to recognize things for what they are, and not and not divert from the situation, from the problem at hand. So we have to recognize that the world is ever changing, and that that the beings, the inhabitants of this world, through the five degenerates, with the proliferation of the five degenerates, then somehow we inhabitants are somewhat disturbed, more disturbed than our ancestors, right? So we also have to. It's equally important that we have to recognize that, right? To recognize that this is important. Yeah, this is important. That was the could you again?
How do we reconcile the two? I think this is fine. So on a practical level, should we remind ourselves that the suffering beings are actually deities? So I think, Rinpoche, you have answered that also, right?
Okay. If you have maybe, so whatever that I have said before, if something is not clear, or if you would like to share something in relation to that, then now would be a good time. So please feel free. I think we have time for one more, please. Oh, the mic? Yeah.
Good evening, Rinpoche. Actually, my question is also related to the very first question that was being asked, that the definition of a Dharma practitioner is one who practice with the concern of not for this life, but for at least for future lives. But then I was thinking to myself that why is this the definition? And then the thing here is that if we take that Dharma as an attitude to our unsubdued mind, so even if we just practice without thinking of future life, let's say generosity versus to miserliness, then isn't that is also a form of Dharma?
Yes, this is a very good question. Yes, and that depends on, again, how we define Dharma, right? So, of course, what we call the ethics, universal ethics, the positive actions, in a way, they are dharmas, right? For example, the 10 virtuous actions, we call them the dharma of the gods, something like that, La Che. So La is God, the God realm, and Che is dharma, right? So on one understanding, we say that all virtuous actions are dharmas, right? So practicing generosity, that is a virtue in itself. So definitely, I would say it is a dharma. Yeah. So you're right. Yeah.
Can I have asked another question?
Okay.
Because the thing here is that this is also related to the same question, but with my another friend view. Because we feel that if we practice in relation to the happiness of this life and our future life, actually there's not much different, because the future life, let's assume that it's most likely it will be another samsaric life. Then what difference does it make?
Yes. There's another good question. So, yes. So we have these different levels of mental disposition, different levels of orientation, right? Different mental capacity. So there is a type of person who can only handle this life. There's a type of person who can not only handle, who can not only see the benefits of this life, but can also see that it can also be extended to future lives as well, right? And then this was your second example, and then you mentioned, well, if that was the case, then this would be very, if one is simply doing positive, practicing good actions only for good future rebirth, then you're right. In a way, this is very similar to. In a way, it is similar to only thinking about the pleasures of this life, right? So thinking only about the pleasures of this life and then the pleasures of future lives is similar, because future is just a matter of time, and then that would become this life, right? So in a way, you were just only thinking about this life, or just one life, right? So then, when you ask it like this, then with this kind of investigation, with this kind of approach, then this would lead into, looking even beyond just future lives, right? So then this would be then to accept that even if we, let's say, take a good rebirth, then there's still no guarantee that we would, in that future life, that we would again continue sowing the positive seeds and then ripening the positive seeds. There's no guarantee that we will do that in the future life, right? And if we do not do that, then again there's the likelihood that we would again go back to where we were before, right? So then this cycle, it just goes and goes and goes. It just goes, right? It just continues, right? So by thinking like this, then we want to stop this cycle, right? So this, of course, then leads to this approach then leads to developing renunciation. So this is so on that note, right? So this is a good time now to, I think, to stop for today. Yeah. So it's very auspicious. Thank you. Oh.